Before we jump into today's video, I just want to let you know that most of it was scripted and filmed in 2020 for an online public speaking competition. I've mostly used the original video, but I have gone in and added some new sections to help clarify things and also further explain some things that I didn't have time for in the original thing. And though my background and setup has changed multiple times since the original video, I was at least able to find the original costume, so enjoy.
In 1,000 years or so, what will music sound like? An interesting question. The music of today sounds fundamentally different than it did 1,000 years ago. Structures of harmony, rhythm, even tuning systems have changed. And more importantly, the instruments we use to create music have changed completely. Or have they? Because sound, and therefore music, is just applied physics. Don't worry, this isn't about to turn into a physics lecture. So, if the laws of physics haven't changed in the past 1,000 years, though our understanding of them may have, the ways we have of creating sound can't have changed that much either. What is sound in terms of physics? Well, sound is just a vibration in the air. So to create a sound, and therefore to create music, we need a stimulus that will create a vibration in the air. Now, musicologists have spent many years collecting and analysing the instruments of the world and classifying them based on how they generate and stimulate these vibrations in the air. Let's take a look at an example of classification, the Hornbostol System.
I should clarify, the Hornbostol System is about classifying instruments based on the way they physically create sound. Typically, we think of instrument classification in other ways. For example, we could group instruments based on pitch or pitch range. We could have bass instruments, tenors, altos, and sopranos based on the frequency range that that instrument occupies. We also group instruments based on the way that they are played. We might separate woodwinds and brass instruments because they are played using different techniques, though they both use our breath to create sound. We could divide woodwinds further into single and double reed instruments. The Hornbostol System classifies instruments based on how they produce sound waves. So, as you will see, range is not that much of a concern, and neither are the differences between brass and woodwind or double and single reed. So,
the Hornbostol System, which outlines 5 different types of instruments based on how they generate sound. They are idiophones, membranophones, chordophones, aerophones, and electrophones. Let's talk through them. Idiophones are solid objects that vibrate and then dissipate that sound to the air. Examples include xylophones, marimbas, or cymbals, which when struck, vibrate within themselves and then transfer that vibration to the air as sound. Membranophones are constructed of flexible, suspended surfaces that vibrate and then become sound as they dissipate their vibration to the air. An example is a drum, the skin of which is a membrane that vibrates when struck to create a sound. Chordophones are stringed instruments, the strings of which vibrate to create sound. They can be strummed, plucked, like a guitar, or hammered, like on a piano, or even bowed, like on a violin or a cello. Next is aerophones, which are wind instruments that vibrate the air directly. They include woodwind instruments like flute or saxophone, or brass instruments like the trumpet. And lastly, electrophones, which create their waves digitally and then manifest them. Electrophones include synthesizers and drum machines. Now, the Hornbostol System is in some ways flawed.
let's talk about these flaws. Firstly, this 5-point system doesn't really distinguish between the differences within each category, like the brass and woodwind example I raised earlier, both of which fit into aerophones but are played in different ways. Now, there are subcategories in this system, but the 5 main categories are the centerpiece. But there are still some flaws even there. If we take a look at a clarinet and a flute, both use air to create sound, yes, but the clarinet is using a vibrating reed, which is stimulated by that air. Could the reed be considered a membrane, and thus a clarinet considered a membranophone? The Hornbostol system isn't really clear on that. There are different subcategories, as I mentioned, to help clarify things like this, but they aren't particularly satisfying. I personally think it's contentious whether a clarinet is an aerophone with a membrane or a membranophone that is stimulated by air. Another issue is with electrophones. This category was added after the original system was created, in response to developments in electronic instruments. The sounds of these instruments have their origin in electronics. A synthesizer sound is generated either electrically, in a circuit, or digitally in a computer chip. But these sounds have to pass through an amplifier to actually be heard. That could be an actual amp, or it could be speakers, like these ones, or even smaller speakers like headphones. Even the iwi, which is triggered by air, like an aerophone, and generates its sound electrically, like an electrophone, has to still have its sound pass through the membranophone of a speaker for you to be able to perceive its sound. Therefore, I would argue most, if not all, electrophones are actually functionally membranophones. They have to be played through the membrane of a speaker to actually be heard and perceived in the real world.
But it does point to an interesting concept, the idea that the methods we have of creating sound are fundamentally limited. This is why there have been very few newly invented instruments in recent history. Let's take a look at some examples. One of the more common modern instruments is the saxophone, which was invented relatively recently in the 19th century by Adolf Sax. It's a metal horn that has keys that can be pressed down to change the pitch. But it has a mouthpiece with a single reed, very similar to its predecessor, the clarinet. They're definitely different instruments, but they're not fundamentally different ways of creating sound. But what about something that is quite different? Let's take a look at the hydraulophone. Steve Mann, who invented the hydraulophone, noticed something about the instruments we've looked at before. Idiophones, membranophones, and quartophones all comprise different types of solid objects. He calls them gaiaphones, which means earth instruments. They're comprised of solid matter that vibrates. Aerophones, on the other hand, use gaseous matter. They're air instruments. If you've watched Avatar: The Last Airbender, you know where we're going next. The hydraulophone uses a different state of matter. It uses a liquid, water, to create sound. The water within the instrument vibrates at different frequencies to create sound. It creates this really cool ethereal sound,
Which sounds like...
But the hydraulophone is a bit of a flawed instrument. It doesn't really translate well to a live musician because it's hard to transport and definitely hard to mic up, especially in a live situation. And the hydraulophone doesn't work well in a studio either because it involves so much water. We don't really want water around the expensive electronic equipment of a studio like microphones and computers. So I don't see instruments using liquid like the hydraulophone catching on that much in the future.
But there's another instrument that defies this classification, one which I also don't think will catch on. If we return to the Avatar: The Last Airbender example, we're still missing another element.
Fire.
If we have solid gaiaphones and gaseous aerophones and liquid hydraulophones, it makes sense that another state of matter, plasma, could also be used to create sounds. This here is what I would call a pyrophone. It's an instrument that is generating sound, vibrations in the air, using different frequencies of electrical arcs. Considering this, we could conceptualize a 4 elements model of instrument classification, where we categorize instruments based on the state of matter that they are vibrating to make sound. Now, though this system is quite fascinating, it's not really that useful, as 2 of these states of matter are either very impractical to use or very dangerous. Or both. But it does show us that the ways we have of creating sound, and therefore designing wholly new instruments, is fundamentally limited by the means we have of creating vibrations and therefore sound waves.
So, music in the future will definitely be different. Rhythm, harmony, these structures and tuning systems will definitely be different, but the methods we have of creating sound are limited, so the instruments that we use can't really be that different from what we use today. Music in the future will definitely be different, but maybe not that different.
Hey, hopefully you found this video about the Hornbostol sax system and instrument classification and the future of music interesting. If you did, I have other videos like it here on the channel, and I make music videos and videos about music all the time. I'm constantly trying to explore different areas of music through video here on the YouTube channel, so if that's something that interests you, consider subscribing. I have up here a couple of videos that are maybe related to this one or maybe otherwise interesting, so maybe consider watching one of those. But until next time,